Excellencies, distinguished delegates, could I ask you to take your seats again? We have nothing, eh? We have. Okay. Good morning to all of you, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. If you could please take your seats because this is our last day. We still have some work to do. Time is precious. Let me start by asking some flexibility from you. Because yesterday evening you received a text. And this is not an officially revised version of the rolling text, of course. I announced it already earlier the week. There were some thoughts for me with regard to text that was proposed by delegations during the meeting yesterday that could be a way forward. Between yesterday evening and now, I have continued some consultations, and I think we need to make an extra effort and then especially focus on the critical functions. So in the version you received yesterday evening, there is text, for instance, on functional and integrated. There is something already on the temporal element. And a small change was made again with regard to para 2 with regard to lethal. And I do remember also proposals from delegations to add something to para 1 with regard to lethality. But I would like to set that aside. And don't you worry, your positions are protected. I know what you have said. And those issues have not been solved. But as I said before, I would now like to concentrate really on the critical functions. And that is why I sent around earlier some additional thoughts. And those additional thoughts are concentrated on the issue of identification. Because identification is something we have been discussing over the last few days in a very, very intense manner. And I think we are not too far away from having a common understanding. But the issue is, of course, how to put that in wording, and how to put that in wording that also people outside this room, without extensive notes, understand what we mean by that. And perhaps, and yesterday already, the distinguished representative of the ICRC made some proposals. And I have the impression that those proposals could build a bridge between the two sides of the room. One side that says we need identifying, the other side says it's included in select. But how to reflect that in the text? Could we have the other version? we have to be a bit patient with the technology. Thank you. There we have it. So what we have done here is identify, is now included in 1A, but we have a 1Bs. And there we describe how the function of identification should be defined in the process of identifying, selecting, and engaging a target. And this text builds very much upon what we discussed at the end of May in the, I would say, the online workshop, where we had an in-depth discussion on how there are different forms of identification. Identification in a pre-activation phase, or an identification that takes place after activation and that encompasses it in a broad sense, so that it would include everything from finding new targets to matching pre-programmed general targets to a specific target that the system encounters. Or identification that is only classifying the target as the intended target. Earlier this week, we had a paper from the US also dealing with this topic. And I think we have to provide clarity that the characterization we have will, on the one hand, not be too wide, and on the other hand, not be too narrow. Having said that, I think we should also be realistic that within this characterization, we cannot solve all problems. And it has been said a number of times that this is to have a common understanding of what laws are, but that we are working, of course, not yet on an instrument, but on a set of elements, but that we should also see this set as elements as a set. So not everything is in box one, and certainly not everything is in parallel one, but in the end, we should see it as one text. But of course, we cannot work around a clear understanding of the three critical functions. And with the text we have now proposed under 1 and 1Bs, I think we have a good basis for reflecting the understanding we have been building for the last few days. And no doubt it can be further improved, but I would highly appreciate your flexibility to now spend some time on this text and see whether this provides a possible bridge between the views in the room and also a path forward with regard to our characterization. And with that, I would like to open the floor. And I recognize the distinguished representative of the ICSC. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We thought it might help for us to start first and give some context into how we came about this definition before we hear more from the other delegations about their views. So just to give some context, we've listened with interest to all the proposals made by delegations throughout the past week on the critical functions of lethal autonomous weapon systems. We think there is a broad convergence in the room on the functions that we are indeed intending to cover, even if we disagree on the terminology and which specific terms, whether that is identify or select, would best capture that. Our concern initially with including identify on its own without a definition was that it could be read as the presetting of a target profile. If read this way, it could require all laws to have the ability to preset their own target profile, which would exclude many autonomous weapon systems who do not have such capability. Now, we think that a good way forward would be perhaps to include identify in the characterization, while outlining a common understanding of what identify means through the paragraph of 1 bis. That way, we incorporate a function that some delegations consider essential to the characterization of laws, and at the same time, with adding a definition, this would help ensure that we're all talking about the same thing, and it would also help ensure that some of the concerns voiced by some delegations, including our own, on the inclusion of identify would be met. And so we suggested some wording for 1 bis accordingly, and we look forward to hearing the views of different delegations, including as well on suggestions on how the wording can be refined further. I thank you.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of the ICSC for providing us with further clarification and background on this proposal. Who would like to join in? Yes, I recognize the distinguished representative of APILS. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I am delivering this intervention on behalf of the delegation of Utrecht University and my own delegation, that of the Asia-Pacific Institute for Law and Security, or APILS. Many thanks to you, Chair, and your team for your tireless efforts to find a workable solution to the problem of characterization. Thank you also to all the delegations that have shown flexibility over the past few days and put forward constructive proposals for new language. Part of the difficulty that the group has encountered with respect to the word identify arises from the different uses of the word. For some, the identification of targets seems to mean the process of developing target profiles. And by target profiles, we mean sets of criteria that intended targets must meet. For example, to neutralize radar systems, a target profile may include all objects emitting electromagnetic radiation of a frequency that is known to be used by the radar system. For others, the identification of targets seems to mean the process of recognizing persons or objects in the operational environment that meet a target profile. Put differently, identification in this sense involves the matching of actual persons or objects encountered in the environment against a preset target profile. In our example, this would involve using sensors to detect whether a particular object in fact emits electromagnetic radiation at a specific frequency. Using the word identify in the first sense, developing its own target profiles, would radically narrow the application of the elements that the group has been drafting. It would then not cover the much wider range of systems that would quite appropriately fall under regulations and compliance measures on the second tier of the two-tier approach. In our view, where a system matches without human intervention persons or objects against target profiles, in order to then select and engage them, creates challenges for compliance with IHL. It is precisely these kinds of challenges that the compliance enhancing measures in boxes 3 through 5 would helpfully address. We believe that the proposed new paragraph 1 bis comprehensively addresses this problem, both by explaining what the inclusion of identification function means and what it does not mean. We are therefore very supportive of paragraph 1 bis. We also express our appreciation to the ICRC for proposing this new language. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of APILS, also speaking on behalf of Utrecht University. Any further requests for the floor? I recognize the distinguished representative of Ukraine. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving the floor to my delegation. And let me please just jump straight to the point. The delegation of Ukraine believes that in the definition, word terms that are not common for the existing legal rules. And this is not bad for the development of the CCW to introduce new terms in its protocols, and therefore the delegation of Ukraine is entirely comfortable with adding new terms in the realm of international law. The question that seems to be pivotal here is, what are those terms and where do they come from? It would be dangerous to invent terms just for the sake of invention. Looking at the history of the convention, our delegation observes that new terms that have been introduced previously were based on actual military realities. We suggest the same approach here. We're deeply convinced that the entire issue of the laws is about decision-making and responsibility for the decision-making. It is not a question of artificial intelligence in general that is regulated by other international instruments. However, in this group of governmental experts, we must stay within the military use of artificial intelligence. Speaking of military use, military decision-making has 4 stages. Selection and identification are parts of the same exercise of separation of the target from the rest of material objects. Perhaps this could be appropriate to define the notions of selection and identification in a commentary, but to our opinion, not in the instrument itself. We invite the delegations to use the Occam razor wisely and base the definition in the reality, avoiding adding any unnecessary terms. Thank you, Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine for stating the position of his delegation. Next on my list is the distinguished representative of Pakistan. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Let me at the outset thank you and your entire team for steering the conversation forward on this very essential issue. Chair, I think your frequent reminders about where we are in the process really helps us orient about what we are trying to do here when we try to improve characterization. And as you have reminded us just now as well, my delegation thinks also believes, in fact, that we are not negotiating an instrument. We are coming up with set of elements of an instrument, hopefully that will go on in any future instrument. Therefore, we are very comfortable with the idea of having more language to, as far as it can help us solve a problem. When the issue of identify was discussed, and we had heard very closely the remarks and the interests from various colleagues who wanted to have this term included in the definition, we had raised a few questions. We had raised questions primarily that perhaps we were not sure where the stage of identify would lie, which task is being alluded to when we use the term identify, whether it is in the design phase when the programmers encode certain target profiles, for instance, a radar profile. Is it at the operational level when the commanders are making a positive identification under the IHL, or is it a sensor-based classification? We think that if the term identify is to be included in the text, and which you have presented now this morning, perhaps an additional text, as ICRC has also suggested and very eloquently explained this morning, would be in order to arrive at a common understanding of what we mean by identify, if we are including that. And when we look at the language of 1bis, it's not on the screen right now, but I think it has two important components. One is the exact definition of what do we mean by identify. It's a process where environment scanning is taking place for potential matching with the target profiles. And the second important element is also to address the loophole that many states had earlier pointed out, that the fact that certain target profiles could be pre-programmed by human operators would not rule out the classification of system as lethal autonomous weapon systems. So it very clearly establishes where in that stage of the moment of engagement or moment of use, this process of identification is taking place. So it helps us narrow down those tasks and those stages. So we are very happy to support the latest text as it appears in 1bis, and we can work on any further minor tweaks if they're required to further improve that understanding. But lastly, I think where we are in the process, we have been able to narrow down what kind of systems we are talking about to be covered in the scope of this instrument, and this latest text helps reflect that common understanding. So thank you once again to you, your team, and especially to the delegation of ICRC who have brought this text forward.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for stating the position of his delegation and commenting on the text put on the screen. Who else would like to take the floor? I recognize the distinguished representative of the United States, and I also saw the plaque from Panama. Now, be careful. This is like an ocean. If you wave with your hands, you are in for something. But first, the distinguished representative of the United States. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Again, it's nice to come in behind a delegation where you can largely agree with the points that were made, and so I wanted to register our appreciation to the delegation of Pakistan for making a number of points that I think we'll likely want to emphasize. We do generally support this approach, Chair. We think it, and we thank the ICRC for the idea and for the initiative and for a concrete proposal. We think it's a good way to try to take this conversation forward. I think what we're seeing in the course of the week and in the course of the discussion of this issue is that we are now at a very, very high level of sophistication in the way we're addressing these concepts. We're struggling with whether the shorter form of words is capable of capturing all of the nuance and And I think from the perspective of our delegation, and this was one of the purposes behind the working paper that we circulated earlier in the week, we wanted to try to draw out and crystallize some of these tougher problems. I think we all now are seeing the problems much more clearly as a result of the discussion this week, and that's a good thing. Part of the purpose of our paper was to try to see where there were shared understandings that wouldn't necessarily need to be reflected in more detailed language. But there do seem to be issues like this one where I think, Chair, we do need a little bit more. And so in that sense, this is a useful proposal. I'll just make the kind of broader and maybe more obvious point that there may be other issues like this down the road, and whether we do it now or we do it later, there likely will be the need for this group to get down to that next level on other issues. But as you say, Chair, it's not clear that we need to do that now on all the issues in order to fulfill our mandate and to move the conversation forward. So, Chair, in terms of the specific language, and here I'm just focusing on the select and engage issue. There are other issues that our delegation and other delegations have raised about other aspects of this. And we obviously are only focusing now on the very, very focused question that you've put before us. We see this 1 bis as crystallizing a key issue. What types of weapons are in and what types of weapons are out? That's something that people have really struggled with, and the identification issue is, I think, is the issue that is most focused us on that question. We think that some of the language may need to be tweaked a little bit. I'm not sure we're at a point now where we can suggest something specific, but maybe just to capture the problem that we see, in particular with the second sentence. So for us, and our working paper tried to make this clear, if we have a scenario where the operator picks a single target and then sends the weapon out to get the single target, that for us is something that we think would be out, and this current formulation would include it. There may be ways to tweak it. I think what this is intending to capture is that if you have, say, a programmer in the programming stage identifying a set of targets that are pre-programmed, and then you move into an operator stage, that the operator then is able to rely on that pre-programming. I think there seems to be consensus that that's absolutely something that we do want to cover. And so it may just be a matter of language tweaks, but it does illustrate a little bit the further work we need to do to differentiate between what the operator is doing, what the programmer is doing. But aside from that small point, we do think that this is very promising text. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States for commenting on the text. And next on my list is the distinguished representative of Panama, to be followed by the United Arab Emirates and India. But let me first pass the floor to the distinguished representative of Panama. Madam, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I'd also like to align myself with those who have thanked you for the incredible work that you and your team have been carrying out to attempt to come up with points of commonality and agreements, taking into account the discussions we've heard over the last week and the concerns raised by various delegations regarding the proposals we've been analysing here in relation to Box 1. I'd also like to thank the ICRC for this suggestion, which we think is fairly elegant, although our preference would have been to stick to the terms select and engage. We do understand that in terms of the work that's been done, we want to show the greatest flexibility possible to try and accommodate all of those who have insisted that it's important that we include this reference to identify. As we said on other occasions, our concern about including this term is that various different interpretations can be brought to that by different states. And that's to say, and as the distinguished representative of Pakistan mentioned, the doubt here would be where or at what point does that identification happen? Is it during the design? Is it during the operational phase or sensor phase? And the concern we have here is that we're not limiting ourselves to the pre-establishment, the establishment of targets in advance. And as paragraph 17 of the background paper said, it raises it and defines very well the different definitions of identification in that regard. We have concerns there. So when we're characterizing laws, we think that might ascribe to them a role that is usually carried out by human beings and would run against the provision which we are trying to come up with here when we are addressing the phenomenon of laws and excluding from their sphere of operation the majority of those roles and defining the degree of autonomy. This is why we support ICRC's proposal, including paragraph 1 bis, which would guarantee that we all share a common understanding for the aims for the purposes of the ruling text, what's understood by identification. And we stand ready to work constructively to meet and address any concern that might be raised in this regard. But we do think that the way that it's drafted can be fully supported by my delegation. Thank you, Chair.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of Panama and pass the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, to be followed by India and the Russian Federation. But first, the United Arab Emirates. You have the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. First of all, I would like also to thank you for the efforts you've made, which have allowed us all to reach this outcome. We support what you say concerning laws, and in that connection, we want to share a number of comments and express our support for some elements. We support the involvement of the term identification in order to avoid any loopholes. This isn't just a simple characterization of the target, because we do support the elegant wording which makes it clear that we're dealing here with systems which might give rise to concerns, in particular with regards to Article 37 and the fact that we mustn't amend the roles of systems under that definition, as was said by other delegates. We do support the ICRC's position, which we think would allow us to bridge any gaps here and properly take into account the preceding definition and the targeting phase. Also, we believe that any other improvised approach wouldn't allow us to ensure identification is properly dealt with. The role of the human element here must be taken into account to ensure that laws are properly under the scope of human control. Generally speaking, we support efforts being made internationally so that we can use this technology responsibly. Everything done under this ambit must come under the aegis of international humanitarian law and ensure that it deals with any shortcoming which might threaten and jeopardize international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates. Let me now pass the floor to the distinguished representative of India, to be followed by the Russian Federation, the Republic of Korea, and Mexico. But first, the distinguished representative of India. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Coordinator, Mr. Chairperson, for giving my delegation the floor. I wanted to, at the outset, convey my delegation's thanks to you, and also the remarkable work which the group has done, which has been reflected through the sophisticated and very technical discussions we've had on the characterization. And what we've seen over this session and also in the last session is that there is a very high level of granularity that we are developing in terms of understanding fundamental concepts with regard to lethal autonomous weapon systems, their characteristic elements, and how these weapon systems actually work. And in that regard, we believe that the group has been able to succeed on that front, which is to be able to deepen our discussion. So we want to thank you for proposing this new characterization, which actually helps us in furthering our understanding on these issues. Like many other delegations, we also believe that the characterization should be fit for purpose. It should be forward-looking, it should be progressive, and it should be appropriate in line of the instrument that we are seeking to negotiate. And in one of the interventions that we made during the opening days, we also mentioned that if the characterization is too small, then we end up restricting weapons that should be covered in the instrument. But if it is too broad, then we probably might elude the focus. So we need to balance both these imperatives. My delegation was also one of the delegations that supported the explicit reference to the word identification, because we thought that the autonomous systems, as we see them, which work on AI and which work on machine learning and deep learning, go through a number of stages, and they autonomously identify, select, and engage. And we thought that the word identify gives us a greater cushion to be able to explain to ourselves and to others that we're looking at these sophisticated systems. And if we were to only restrict our characterization to select and engage, we would have inadvertently covered a number of systems that are not autonomous and systems that have been used over the years. And that includes trigger-based weapon systems, anti-personnel mines, IEDs with sensors, even weapons such as laser-guided munitions in which the identification is done by a human would also get covered if the word identification does not exist. And it would also cover systems such as fire and forget missiles. And I had also given an example of border turrets and sentry guns, which are automatic weapons which do not really independently identify friend foe, but they automatically fire upon once the sensor is activated. So I think we were seeking a way to exclude these systems, which in our way have been, in our understanding, have been used for a number of years now, and which are not truly autonomous in the sense of using machine learning to actively identify, select, and engage targets. So in that sense, we welcome the explanation which is given by SERC, and I think it does help us in understanding how identification as a task is different from pre-programming of target profiles. And I think it's useful for us and also useful for the group to understand that when we talk about pre-programming of target profiles, then we're probably not talking of identification. Identification happens close to selection and engagement. So in that sense, we appreciate their comment, and we would also like to say that we are open to how we embed this notion either in the characterization that we have, or we develop a separate commentary. We do not want to undermine your work, but in whichever way we can come to a common understanding on this, either in written form or otherwise, I think that's what we are looking at, which is that the room should be able to come to a common interpretation of that. I also wanted to comment a little on the pre-programming of potential targets or a target profile, that if the pre-programming target profile is very granular, very discrete, that it doesn't really leave any autonomy to the weapon system to actually decide the target, then it actually does not, the weapon is not able to do its real purpose, which is to actively take a decision and autonomously decide on which targets it wants to engage in. So a pre-programming which is very narrow, which is very narrow in scope, which identifies the target, or of a nature of identifying a target, would probably would not leave autonomy for the system to be exercised. And I think in that regard, we appreciate also the comments made by the US delegation in that context. Lastly, in the informal discussions that we had today, I had referred to one of the concerns we have. We are very flexible on this, and we want to see what the room thinks about it. But our understanding is that with the present characterization that we have in para 1, which talks about without intervention by a human operator, it also inadvertently or advertently covers some of the systems which we have been using from 3 or 4 decades back, including air defense systems, close-in weapon systems, and active protection systems. And my understanding is that these systems per se are defensive systems that actually help in compliance with the international humanitarian law where they are deployed. But with the characterization that we have at this stage, it would also include those systems which, in our view, do not pose the kind of risks that we tend to address from the autonomous systems, such as loitering munitions that cannot be, for instance, be recalled back, systems that are able to autonomously identify, select, and engage, and there is no way that a human can, override the functioning of those weapons. And I think those are the weapons which the group should ideally look at. But we remain flexible. Our comment, therefore, was that instead of without intervention, it should be without the possibility of intervention. But we are willing to discuss this proposal, as we understand that some may not share our understanding, and that we will be willing to engage in discussions whenever these take place in the future. I thank you.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of India for his comments, remarks, and also his flexibility. And of course, this is not the end of the discussion. We have also a para 3, and we have a whole, we have 4 other boxes also with elements that in the end will make together a set on the scope also of the instrument, and what's included and not included. Next on my list is the Russian Federation, to be followed by the Republic of Korea, Mexico, and Singapore. But first, the Russian Federation. Sir, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, allow me to thank you for your further efforts to find a compromise regarding the working characteristics and the working definitions of a weapon system which is being considered by this group of governmental experts. We are grateful also that we are with you trying to bring clarity and precision to this definition in order to avoid any interpretation in the future and to hash out a common understanding of what the scale of discussion and the scope of this GGE's work is. We would also, like previous delegations, to share some preliminary assessments strictly on the questions linked to the function of identification, selection, and engagement of targets. Because on the other aspects, we also have a number of considerations which we have already shared with the group. As regards these terms and functions, we have several times expressed our relatively flexible position regarding this matter. For our delegation, this question is not the most critical or fundamental one in the context of the development of the working characteristics and definitions of the group. And that's why we would be ready to agree to the inclusion of 2 functions, select and engage, or 3, identify, select, and engage a target, in order to reach consensus and find a compromise. We'd like to once again underscore that our position is unchanged in this respect, and for the sake of continuing the discussion on other more important aspects on the basis of these working characteristics and definitions, we would be ready to accept either option. As regards the new addition, which we've heard, including in paragraph 1 bis, overall, we are not against working on a terminology basis. We have already spoken about this several times earlier. Our delegation considers it is extremely important to develop a terminological base regarding the different aspects linked to these weapon systems and their functioning. But if we go down that path, then we feel we would need to give this exercise a very comprehensive nature and to not pick out just one aspect. And in that case, we would be open to working on the wording regarding the function of identification, which has been proposed by the ICRC. This can be done, but in that case, we feel it would be all important as a minimum to do the same also for the other two functions which are here, namely engaging a target and selecting a target, as those functions will be linked to the function of identification. And in this case, we would like to understand where does identification as a function end and where does the function of selection begin? What is the difference between the two functions? And the same applies also to the function of engaging a target. When do we move from the selection to the engagement of a target? Where does that transition, that transit period happen? All of these are very important issues. And if the group is set on at this stage already bringing clarity to those aspects, then we are open to that and we are ready to work on it. But in that case, we have to all bear in mind, given the level of seriousness of the discussion that we'd have to have, that this discussion will require time, it will require additional efforts and a certain level of expertise, and we will need to be prepared for the fact that the remaining time for the work of this GGE might not be sufficient, given that we are gradually going to have to start moving on a draft report for the group. And we still have 2 sessions, so 10 days for achieving that. So without prejudging the result, we would like to, at this stage, given that we feel this is quite critical in the context of the future work of the group and the delivery of its mandate, to decide what exactly we want to work on. Do we want to work on developing a detailed terminological basis, and then we would be happy to, or are we happy to focus on simply a general understanding of the working functionalities and characteristics of these weapon systems, in order to have a basis for other understandings which are contained in the other sections of the rolling text. Furthermore, Chair, in paragraph 1 bis, we feel that there are 2 very different ideas that are combined here. The first sentence refers directly to an attempt to define what we understand by identification. And as we said, we would be happy to work on that. to determine the function that would be given to these systems that they might possess. But in the second sentence, we're referring to a completely different aspect, which is not linked to the understanding of identify. It is linked to the concept and the category which we believe we had already found some common understanding for, which is the category of human control, the category of human intervention, which is contained in the definition, because the second sentence defines what human control is, or human intervention, and what is not, and therefore what constitutes the understanding or the concept of autonomy and what does not. In our view, this is a completely separate topic. And again, if we are going to come back to discussing the term autonomy, then we can come back to that. But in that case, we will need a very comprehensive discussion of the other key definitions that relate to autonomy, namely the wording regarding human intervention, and that will also need to be discussed thoroughly. Once again, our delegation stands ready and to be open to these discussions, and we would be ready to work for the sake of the fulfillment of our mandate and for the sake of finding a satisfactory result and a detailed understanding concerning the various aspects. But again, we do have to take time into consideration, and we need to see that the ultimate purpose is preparing a report, and we have to tailor our ambitions to the resources that the group has. We'd also like, by way of conclusion, to underscore that the function of identification, as we understand it, overall is covered by the selection of a target, because selecting a target without identifying it, as we see it, is hardly possible. All the more so if we are speaking of concepts in the context of the fulfillment of international humanitarian law, where there are fundamental principles which set out the need for identification of a target. Thank you.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. And indeed, your view is very well known. And I think if we would have 128 of those with regard to identify, select, and engage, we would now have been somewhere on the terrace having drinks. But yes, we have a different situation in the room. For others, it does make a difference whether we include identification or not. And yes, you very much have also a point with regard to time constraints, and I'm very much acutely aware of that. And with regard to the level of detail, I would like to summarize in a one-liner that my aim is to be as generally as possible and as detailed as necessary. Because in the end, I think that was also said by a few others earlier today, we need to have a common understanding, because if we try to reason around it, that will not work in the future. On the other hand, this is not yet an instrument, and there could also be further work. Do we need to dive into everything? I don't think so at this moment. But certain things we probably cannot evade if we want to have this common understanding on what is considered to be the critical part, I would almost say, of our work, this set of elements. But thank you very much for reminding us and also already for looking forward with regard to the report. I will say a few things on that also in the afternoon. And also thank you for your for being prepared to continue this discussion now. Next on my list is the Republic of Korea, to be followed by Mexico. But first, the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me join others first, thanking you and your team again to come up with a new proposal about the text. And also, as you said, I think our informal consultation during the intersessional period helped build shared understanding on this critical part, and also a US working paper early this week, and the proposals from various delegations, Singapore, the UK, and ICRC. I would like to thank all of them for helping us to have a shared understanding on this critical parts. And also, I think I forgot to say at the beginning that we are on the Friday today, so it's a happy Friday to all. And we're almost during the end of our session. And I think naturally we are arriving at the stage that now I need to bring this back to my capital and have an interagency review on this new text. So I will offer only a preliminary comment on the new text. And similar to what U.S. delegation said, we are agreeing with the general approach of this direction that, as I already said yesterday, that if we have a little more explanation on identify, I think we can have a shared understanding on that and agree on the text. And one piece, we also share the similar concerns with India and the US that the second part of the sentence, when it talks about this selecting the targets, I think that's it's not clear what that means. I think what it meant was the setting the parameters or target profiles, which is contained in the last part of the paragraph. And that's what I heard from also the explanation from the ICRC. So if we can tweak a little bit of that parts, then in general, I think we can work on this. And finally, we take the two steps further from this point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. Next on my list is the distinguished representative of Mexico, to be followed by Singapore, then ICRAC, South Africa, and Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. But let me first pass the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm taking the floor first and foremost to thank you for the document concerning the additional considerations related to the critical functions of lethal autonomous weapons systems, which has helped us to clarify and better distinguish where we're at right now. My delegation feels that the proposal made by the ICRC that we're looking at now is a step in the right direction that can help us to join the considerations of various delegations and clarify things. That said, we do have a doubt, not really a concern, but a doubt. We share the doubt that the Russian Federation just voiced as to whether or not it is necessary to dedicate a lot of time to defining various concepts in order to conclude on a section of definitions. We feel that is not the intention. As you said, you don't feel it's necessary in all of the paragraphs and for all of the concepts, but my delegation would be ready to work on a glossary section or a section of definitions if that could help ensure that we all share a common understanding and that we can be sure that everybody understands the various elements in order to move ahead towards our final goal, which is to have a more robust legal framework in this field. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for stating the position of her delegation. Next is distinguished representative of Singapore. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My delegation thanks you and your team for working hard in seeking constructive input and working on the new proposal. We agree that the proposal on screen is a good compromise on the basis that reflects the understanding that we have been building while addressing concerns by many. For this, we express our appreciation to the ICR as well for the hard work in formulating the new text. Preliminarily, we are of the view that paragraph 1 and paragraph 1 bis is something that my delegation can favorably consider. We may return at a later stage after further discussions and listening to the floor before proposing minor adjustments to improve paragraph 1 bis if required. I thank you, Chair.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of Singapore for sharing the views of his delegation and for his preparedness to work on this text. Next on my list is the distinguished representative of ICRAC. You have the floor.
Chair. ICRAC has listened with great interest as states have shared their views on the characterization of autonomous weapons. As a group of technical and academic experts, ICRAC has a number of concerns and comments with regard to the proposed changes of revised Box 1, particularly paragraph 1, and the additional thoughts on the concept of identification shared by the chair this morning. We welcome the qualification of functionality to functionally integrated combination, and we agree that this clarifies that such systems need not be physically co-located or bounded as a distinct, individuated, or persistent system. The language would be even more clearly stated as a combination of one or more weapons and technological components functionally integrated in their use. The latter part of that sentence is more difficult for us to accept in its proposed form for several reasons. As it's stated now, quote, that can, once activated, use information in the environment to identify, select, and engage a target without intervention by a human operator, end quote. While the sentiments behind the notion of activation in relation to autonomous weapons is intuitive, we fear this will not be reflected in the variety of operational modes of future systems. Such systems might be activated for long periods of time, checked in on or intervened on periodically by operators for various reasons, and engage at various points in time. Similarly, such systems might have a patrol mode in which they are not authorized to engage weapons, or modes in which they must obtain human authorization in order to engage targets, versus other modes under which they may engage weapons without further human intervention or authorization. What is significant is the authorization to engage weapons against targets, and what level of description and understanding of what those targets are at the time of authorization by the human that is required, not the activation of the system or a function or modality of that system. We also appreciate the sentiment behind the phrase, use of information in the environment. The concern behind this is that autonomous weapon systems will react to environmental conditions of which the operator is unaware at the time of authorization, which raises critical questions of predictability, responsibility, and taking feasible precautions in attack. If I may get philosophical and technical for a moment, information is a property of a system of representation and communication, and in this sense is relative to the design of a system. The environment is literally infinite and unbounded in its potential features, and must be encoded into some system of representation in order to count as data and be interpreted as information. Similarly, the boundaries between a system and its environment is a matter of design decisions regarding assumptions about the features of an expected environment. A set of sensors which are expected to detect and represent those features in a reliable way, and a system of symbolic representation, which might include what we've been calling target profiles, that can apply statistical pattern matching and algorithmic logic to thereby trigger various functionalities of the system, including the engagement of weapons. I will also note here that it is a mistaken anthropomorphization to describe these mechanical, electronic, and logical processes as decisions. Technically, these systems do not see or perceive or decide in the way that human agents do, though they do act in response to sensor data. Whether that sensor data is meaningful, accurate, or reliable representation of, quote unquote, the information in the environment is a matter of engineering and testing. We thus appreciate the suggestions of the ICRC to include the use and application of target profiles and their matching in a more explicit way. We are also very encouraged by the chair's suggestion to use the phrase, a specific target group based on its processing of sensor data. We believe these approaches can support clear norms and regulations around what kinds of target profiles are acceptable under human rights law and IHL and how they might be appropriately regulated. We also agree with other delegations that have argued that qualifying operator with human implies that there may exist non-human operators. As I have argued for many years, there is an implicit assumption in IHL that it is a human who makes the decisions, and we must make explicit when and where those need to continue to be made by humans and when they can be responsibly delegated to machines. We thus encourage dropping human here in favor of just operator. Finally, and most importantly, we have concerns over the potential narrowing of scope of a potential instrument through the addition of qualifications to the characterization of the essential elements of an autonomous weapons system. It is our belief that in a broad sense, the instrument should apply to all weapons and weapon systems and the decision to engage them, in the sense that traditional weapons, such as guns, naturally have context-appropriate human judgment and control all the way through the targeting engagement steps, and thus entail no special additional consideration. Similarly, systems would be prohibited only because they're unpredictable in their effects or use unpredictable technologies. But as weapon systems begin to automate the steps of identification, selection, engagement, they thereby entail additional considerations and potentially regulations or prohibitions. Thus, automated target identification or decision support systems that nominate potential targets are not outright prohibited or subject to all of the regulations applicable to autonomous weapon systems, but should be subject to portions of these regulations that require consideration in the design and development lifecycle, testing and verification, and attention to potential data bias and cognitive biases of operators, even when their outputs go directly to human operators rather than to weapon systems. In our view, the discussion over the meaning of identification, selection, and engagement has demonstrated that there are different ways of dividing up these processes in human operations, and there will be even more ways of dividing these up in the automated systems. We could, through regulation, impose a structure and language to these processes. Indeed, the targeting loops, OODA loops, and so forth that we have heard so much about over the years here of discussion are in themselves formalized processes designed to structure the activities and functions of human organizations, to impose rigor, logic, and accountability to those processes. So we can do the same for technical systems. And in doing so, we can either emulate human systems that we have already designed to do this, or we could formulate the design specifications for technological systems that will meet our legal and ethical requirements for identification, selection, and targeting. We thus welcome further discussion of this critical issue as we move towards a consensus view of how such autonomous systems should be designed and regulated. Thank you.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of ICRAC for deliberating on the text proposed. Next on my list is South Africa, to be followed by campaign to stop killer robots and ENCODE. Please show your plaque if you would like to intervene, because those are the three I have now on my list. But first, the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, we're taking the floor to thank you for the revised text and appreciate your efforts to bring us closer to an agreement on the definition of the systems that we're talking about. In this regard, allow me to express our support for the addition of the word functionally in the definition. We're of the view that it addresses the challenges that we raised yesterday regarding the use of the word functional, and that it will enhance and continue the conversation as we strive to reach consensus and avoid misinterpretation in the definition of laws. We also welcome the inclusion of the term identify in the text. We believe that it is a valuable addition in our efforts towards unpacking the critical process of target selection and engagement, which are central to the debate on meaningful human control. We remain convinced that this addition is important as it reflects a broader spectrum of critical functions. We also like to add our voice to those that supported paragraph 1 bis. I thank you, Chair.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for stating the views of her delegation. Next on my list is the campaign to stop killer robots, to be followed by ENCODE, United Kingdom and Japan. But first, the distinguished representative of the campaign to stop killer robots. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Stop Killer Robots welcomes the update to the language and your additional thoughts on characterizations shared this morning. We are still analyzing these documents, but have some initial thoughts. We had concerns about the introduction of the word the environment in last night's text, but today's 1 bis formulation has responded to these concerns. The return of once activated also raised some questions. However, we appreciate the additional thoughts from the Chair, which recognized that identification can be understood to take place in the development phase, which would be considered pre-activation. For Stop Killer Robots, the development phase of the system should be included in the characterization. This seems to be reflected in 1 bis, but we would like to hear from all states on their understanding. We believe that the characterization should remain broad ahead of formal negotiations. As we have said earlier in the week, Stop Killer Robots believes the progress states have made in their discussions means that the international community can now move to negotiating a legally binding instrument on autonomous weapons systems, taking the work they have done so far as a starting point. States must commit to doing so urgently. We call on states to take the opportunity of this week's discussions to make this commitment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the campaign to stop killer robots, and let me now pass the floor to the distinguished representative of ENCODE, to be followed by the United Kingdom. But first, ENCODE.
Thank you, Chair. We first want to thank you and your team for your efforts and sharing your additional thoughts and offering us 2 paths forward towards a characterization that could find consensus in this room. Regarding the text that is currently on screen, we mainly have a few clarifying questions after listening carefully to the statement the ICRC gave us to be further context to the options that we are discussing currently. Firstly, we would understand the part of 1 bis that reads and matches a person or object against a pre-programmed target profile to reflect the selection process that is employed by a system. Therefore, if this process is included in the understanding of what is considered identification, we would like to hear the thoughts of states and perhaps also the ICRC. What would be the definition of selection? Secondly, we were happy to read in your additional thoughts document that identification that takes place in the development phase pre-activation could be understood to be included in the identification process. We believe that systems that learn which targets to engage with in the development phase and from then autonomously select and engage a target should be included in this characterization. We would thus echo the question posed by the campaign to stop killer robots to see confirmed whether this pre-activation training in the development phase would be included under this definition. Given these points that are at this moment still a bit unclear to us, and given the point that has made earlier by several delegations that coming to the specific definitions in this room might take up a lot of our valuable time, we would like to echo ICRAC that we also see merit in the second option for this text that was offered in the additional thoughts you, Chair, shared with us, such that we could move to the next phase in this process where the exact definitions could be pinned down during negotiations on a legally binding instrument. We're looking forward to hear the reflections in this room on these questions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of ENCODE for commenting on the text. Next on my list is the UK, to be followed by Japan, Norway and Austria. But first, the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We would like to thank also the ICRC for this text, and we agree with the previous interventions that have said that this text presents a promising and practical solution to elucidate the meaningful characterizations that we're addressing when we distinguish the kind of capabilities that we're speaking about here, as opposed to those that we would not understand to be demonstrating the sort of characteristics which might deploy emerging technologies in the areas of laws, as has been at the core of our mandate since the start. We are particularly pleased to hear from those delegations who were concerned that the use of the term identify was necessary to distinguish laws from automatic munitions. And we'd be pleased to hear further on the extent to which this clarification or this suggestion clarifies the point. We note the point made by the Indian delegation about the very specific or narrow pre-programming of a target profile, and we think that perhaps there might be some sort of refinement to the text that has been proposed today, perhaps focusing on the setting of targeting parameters that we would hope might address that, but we will consider that further as this text perhaps develops. If I may also respond on the point made by my Indian colleague that of the suggestion that any possible intervention at a later time might disqualify a system from being an autonomous weapon system. The UK is concerned that this approach would effectively mean that the application of safeguards, including fail-safes, which we've long been discussing as a necessary aspect of this forum, would then effectively take the system out of the technical characterization. So we'd be concerned about how that any such suggestion might be framed in the characterization. And we agree with the suggestion that that might be better addressed later in this document in terms of measures in, say, box 3. We've also heard views of delegations like the Russian delegation, the Mexican delegation, that the function of identification might be covered by selection. And we ourselves have expressed a view similar to that during this week, that identification is a necessary precondition of selection. However, we've also heard the views in this room that identification is a very broad term and has certainly by many delegations in the room been understood in a different manner. We started with this week saying that if we couldn't get a shared understanding in the room, then perhaps modest additions to the text would allow such an understanding to be developed. And we would suggest that these options that have been put forward by the ICRC are certainly a step in the right direction to contain that shared understanding of the critical question.